want to start us out today in Exodus 25. And we're going to look briefly about the tabernacle as opposed to the ark. And we find that there's a significant difference there in how our religious spirits tend to move in preference one over the other. And so we're going to take a look first at the building of this tabernacle and what God said about it. It's a fascinating story to look into in detail if you ever want to just have something to study for the intellect part of it. But God had a lot of details of how to build this tabernacle and the ark and other accoutrements of the tabernacle, down to the minutest little details as what kind of wood to use and what kind of material and the colors and the ornamentation of what things were supposed to be. And in chapter 25 of Exodus in verse 2, we find out that God tells Moses to have the people finance this by giving free will offerings. So this is going to be something done by people just giving of their free will. This is beyond their regular offering and tithes. Verse 2 says, "Speak to the children of Israel that they may bring me an offering. From everyone who gives a willingly with its hearts, you shall take the offering." So that willingness of giving wasn't a requirement and wasn't a demand, and it wasn't a set amount from each person. It was the willingness of their heart. And he goes on and describes he was going to look for linen and animal skin and dyes and oils and wood and all sorts of things, stones. But he makes a list there, and I'm dropping down verse 8. And here God reveals the purpose of this free will offering. He says, "And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them." So he's now talking about, let them make me a place to dwell. Now, this is a God that needs no dwelling place. This is a God that doesn't have to, or he probably can't even fit into a house or a temple or anything like that. But he starts that command out with let them. It's like sort of a desire that people would have to have a place of worship, a place to gather, a place that's considered holy and all like that. And this was just something that they had this urge, and God was aware of it. So he says, "But let them make me a sanctuary," not because God needs one, not because God wanted one, but for the benefit of the people. He said, "Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them." And in verse 9, he goes on, "According to all that I show you, that is the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of its furnishing, so shall you make it." So he goes in and says, now I'm going to let them make this. And they're going to use their free will offering to make this. But it needs to be made by my specifications. And this will serve for them a physical entity by which they can be aware that I dwell amongst them. And he begins, the first thing he starts with is not how to build a tabernacle. He starts right off as how to build this ark. And he tells them how to build the ark, and the ark dimensions are in cubits. You remember the cubit is the distance from the longest finger to your elbow. And generally that's about 20 inches. So from that, taking 20 inches for the cubic measurement, this ark is a rectangle that's about 4 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and 2.5 feet deep. So he tells them to make it. It's lined with made out acacia wood and lined with gold on the inside and outside and ornate. In verse 16, he says, "And you shall put in the ark the testimony which I will give you." So God says, now this ark is going to contain a testimony, and I'm going to give you that testimony. And down to verse, he goes on and describes making this mercy seat. And I'm down at verse 21. The mercy seat is going to be the lid or the covering about it. And he says, "And you shall put the mercy seat on the top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I will give you." And again, he says, there's a testimony I'm going to give you, and that's to be contained within the ark. In verse 22, "And there I will meet you with you, and I speak with you from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim," which were part of the lid, the mercy seat, "which are on the ark of the testimony." Now he's calling this the ark of the testimony, and the testimony is not even in the ark yet. They're building this ark, and he's telling them this testimony that I will give you. "And about everything, and I will give you a commandment to the children." And then he goes on and starts talking about this building this lampstand. I'm going to chapter 26. In 26, it says, moreover, you shall make the tabernacle. Now, this tabernacle is this tent, this sanctuary that he's talked about earlier, this place in which he's going to dwell amongst the people. And he goes on and starts telling them how many curtains and the width and the lengths and all like that. So not being particularly anxious to do a lot of math, I went on the internet to find out what were the dimensions. So there was a courtyard around that had a 8-foot high curtain all around this courtyard. And this courtyard was roughly 50 yards long and 25 yards wide. So it's half of a football field long and then 25 yards wide. So this rectangle, and contained within this rectangle was going to be the tabernacle, a separate tent within the tabernacle called the tabernacle, or the dwelling place. And this tabernacle was also a rectangle. It was about 45 feet long and 15 feet wide. So it's 45 feet long and 15 feet wide. And so it fit nicely in there. And this tabernacle itself was broken into 2 sections. One section was 15 by 15, sort of a squared off room. And that was called the Holy of Holies. And then the front section, which would be the remaining 30 feet by 15 feet, was called the Holy Place. So you have the outer court, the Holy Place, and the Holy of Holies. So there were 3 arenas: the Holy of Holies, that's 15 by 15, and then in front of it was an area that was called the Holy Area, and then that's 15 by 30. And this tent itself was placed within this wall, a curtain wall around that made this courtyard. And this curtain wall was 150 feet or 75 yards, and 50 yards, and by 75 feet or 25 yards. So you had that. So out here was outer court. People were allowed there. Only the priests were allowed in the holies, and only the high priest once a year was allowed in the Holy of Holies. So God was making this dwelling place to make a distinction between levels of holiness to get in the part. And the Holy of Holies areas was where the ark was to be placed. And so they make this while they're in the wilderness. And as they travel around in the wilderness, they carry this. This thing was made out of tents and boards that were made to unhinge and take apart. And there were rings that linked them together. And the Levite tribes were assigned to carry this thing around with them. And so the God would move, and he would stop at a place. And at that place, they would set up the tabernacle and the court and all the accoutrements that went along with that. And the ark was being carried on poles. And they traveled throughout the wilderness. When Joshua comes into the Holy Land, they use the priest carrying the ark to step in the Jordan River, and the Jordan River stops its flow. So everybody gets across, and then the priest carried the ark on across to the other side of the Jordan, and the flow comes through. And this is the time when Jordan was overflowing its banks, and God had stopped that with the priest carrying the ark across into the Jordan. After there, and I'm going to go now forward to Joshua 18:1. And here we find that when they come into this promised land, and they're trying to divide the land up and at the same time conquer and destroy the enemies that inhabit this promised land, they have the Ark and Tabernacle, and they set it up in a town called Shiloh, which is sort of north of where the Jerusalem area is. Jerusalem was not named Jerusalem at that point. And so 18:1 says, now the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh and set up the tabernacle meeting there. And the land was subdued before them. So they wander throughout the wilderness with this tabernacle. They cross the Jordan River into the promised land, and they start conquering things, and they take over and conquer the Shiloh area, which is roughly in the middle, and set up the tabernacle in Shiloh. This is the time of Joshua. And the tabernacle is there throughout the campaigns in Joshua, throughout all the judges, and right up into the time when Samuel, as the last judge, is being born. So it's estimated that it's over 300 years that happened during this time period. And it all appears that they tabernacle was always there in Shiloh, because you go to 1 Samuel chapter 1. And remember, the ark is within the tent of the tabernacle, which is within that court. And 1 Samuel chapter 1, this tells the story about the birth of Samuel. And there's a man that had from the tribe of Ephraim, Elkanah, and he has 2 wives, and one wife has children, and the other wife has none. And Hannah, and it is the wife that has none, but she ends up giving birth to Samuel. In verse 3, it talks about this man, Elkanah, went up from his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. So we have here that even before Samuel's born, people still go to Shiloh, because that's where the tabernacle in the ark is. And there they go to worship God. There they go to bring their sacrifices and their offerings in Shiloh. So it has continued to stay through and be in Shiloh. Now, in 1 Samuel 4, it's a story about where the Philistines are wreaking havoc with the Israelites, primarily because the Israelites have turned away to worship the local gods and not be faithful to God. So he's allowed them to have enemies. And we get for the first time the separation of the ark from the tabernacle. So in chapter 4, the Philistines are beating up on the Israelites, and the Israelites go out to war, and they decide, well, we need help. Go back to Shiloh and bring the ark. Verse 4 of chapter 4, it says, so the people sent to Shiloh that they might bring from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were with the ark of the covenant of God. Now, Eli is the high priest, and he has 2 sons that are very perverted and very wicked and self-serving. And he allows them to be priests, even though Eli was aware of what his sons were doing. They would do things like when the offerings were brought, they put a 3-prong hook and threw it into the offering bat, pulled out, and said, whatever meat's hooked on this God intended for us to have. And they would take females and virgin females and prostitute them in the tabernacle. They were just doing a lot of perverted things. But anyway, since they are the priests, they were responsible for the ark. People want the ark, so they carry the ark down. And the ark is captured by the Philistines. And you're probably all aware of that story. They capture the ark. They had the ark for about 7 or 8 months, and they set up the ark where their god, statue of their god Dagon is, and the statue falls over before the ark, and they stand him back up and prop him again. He falls over again and breaks his leg and his arm and like that. And so they start passing the ark around to other people, other tribes, because the people of the town that had the ark, the Dagon god, kids falling over, bowing down to the ark. And then people start getting sick, and the women become barren, and they start having tumors, as the Bible describes. And they go to the 5 different major cities of the Philistines, and all of them result in the same thing with the ark. And then finally they said, we need to get rid of this ark. And they said, well, let's do a deal. We'll put the ark with 2 cows that have calves. We'll put an offering to them of the tumors and the rats. So we now know they're rat infested with tumors that they had in their groin area and their armpits, which sounds very much like newballs from bubonic plagues that was spread by fleas from rats. So it sounds like that kind of tumors was taking place in there by the descriptives. And they make gold images of their tumors and gold images of rats, one for each of the cities that they were captured, set for each city. And they put it on the ark, and they send off, figuring the cows would turn and go back to the calves. But they go to one of the Israelite towns, and Beth-Shemesh, and there, when they have the ark, the men look into it and they get stricken down. So they send the ark on, and people learn, they recognize and know the ark, and they just start to respect the ark because of all that. If you go with me to Jeremiah chapter 7. Here, God is giving Jeremiah a word to the people about how they have profaned the temple. So this is after the tabernacle. This is the temple has been built, and people are abusing and not following God. But God gives us a little hint of what's going on with respect to the tabernacle back in there, because he references the tabernacle. So I am in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 12. And Jeremiah speaking what the Lord has given them to say to the people. But go now to my place, which was in Shiloh, where I set my name at first, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness my people Israel. And now because you have done these works, says the Lord, and I spoke to you rising up early and speaking to you, and you did not hear, and I called to you, and you did not answer. Therefore, I will do to the house which is called by my name, in which you trust, and to this place which I gave you, and to your fathers, the same as I did in Shiloh. And I'm dropped down to verse 18. And the children gathered wood, and the fathers kindled fire, and the women needed go to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven, and they poured out drink offerings to other gods, that they may provoke me to anger. And now we get to understand that God is simply trying to point out we have a problem with a religious spirit. The people have become religious. They have lost sight of their first love. They have forgotten the purpose of these things, and they now worship these things. I'm going to Psalm 78. Here the psalmist is talking about how the people continue to provoke God, and in the God's being provoked by the people, he brings a judgment on the people, and how the people fail to see the connection between the two. So I'm in Psalm 78, and I'm down at verse 50. This is where the people have started setting up high places, and these were always sites of idolatry type of things. Verse 50, when God heard this, he was furious, and he greatly abhorred Israel. So he forsook the tabernacle at Shiloh, the tent that he had placed among them, and he delivered his strength, and that's probably reference to the Ark of the Covenant, into captivity, and his glory into the enemy's hand. So both Jeremiah and Psalm 78 are after the fact, but they're giving you clarity as to what actually occurred. And back what occurred is the people were worshiping gods in high places. They worshiped the tabernacle itself. They saw it as a tool to help them. So when they were being beaten up by the enemy because of the judgment of God, they bring the ark there, and the ark gets captured. And now we know from Psalms and Jeremiah that God says, I gave it up. I removed myself from this tent that I gave them, and I removed my presence from them and my glory, and allowed it to be captured by the enemy. And so now we have the separation of the ark and the tabernacle. At that time period, now remember, we just looked at verses that were in the future looking backwards, but going back to the time period when this separation was taking place, the tabernacle remained in Shiloh. The ark was taken out, captured by the Philistines, went around all the Philistine 5 towns, and then taken and surrendered back to the Israelite people, and they have it at this guy's house, and he's respecting the ark, and he's being blessed overwhelmingly. Now, in this time period, we had Saul become king, and then David becomes king, and David says, you know, Obed's been really blessed with that ark. I want the ark brought to Jerusalem. He has now established Jerusalem as his headquarters, and he tries to bring the ark there. He eventually does after Uzzah touches the ark and is struck down for irreverence to the ark itself. And he brings the ark to Jerusalem, and David builds his own tabernacle. Now, it doesn't show anywhere in scriptures where God has given David instructions on how to build it. Doesn't say anything about anything other than David builds it. I mean, this becomes known as the Tabernacle of David. So the tabernacle of Moses that had served these people for over 350 years now by this stage of the game still remains in Shiloh. The ark is in Jerusalem in a tabernacle that David built. And there's this separation that's going to be maintained in this process. Now, I want to go to, if I find my reference here, it's Chronicles somewhere. Oh, there it is. 2 Chronicles chapter 1. So in 2 Chronicles, we pick up with Solomon ruling, David turning the throne over to Solomon. So we know that during the time of Samuel and David, during the time of Samuel and Saul, that the tabernacle was in Shiloh and the ark was in Shiloh and then lost to the Philistines and then regained, and it's in a small town. Then after Saul, David becomes king and he moves the ark to Jerusalem to the tabernacle he builds. After David, Solomon becomes king. Now, Solomon is raised up with David as his father. He knows that David has brought the ark. He knows where the ark is. He sees his daddy go to the ark all the time and worship the ark. The ark's right there in Jerusalem. Curious thing happens here. David turns over the throne to Solomon, and Solomon goes to Shiloh. Chapter 1, verse 3. This is Solomon taking over a king. And it says, then Solomon and all the assembly with him went to the high place that was in Gibeon, for the tabernacle meeting with God was there, which God made, the servant of God and made in the wilderness. Now, Solomon goes to the tabernacle, but it's no longer in Shiloh, it's now in Gibeon. And if you did your study of Saul, you'll find that Saul's a Gibeonite. So sometime during Saul's reign, he moves it from the tabernacle from Shiloh to Gibeon. Solomon has the opportunity to go to the ark, but he chooses to go to the tabernacle. And God will meet him, does meet him at the tabernacle. But this all sets up the understanding of a very prominent type of religious spirit that we must recognize and watch out for. The ark represents the presence of God. And if you go to Hebrews chapter 9, we saw earlier in Exodus that they were going to put the testimony that God was going to give them into the ark. And that testimony, or three different testimonies that is presented in there, and Hebrews chapter 9 tells us what's inside that ark. I'm going to pick up with verse 2. The tabernacle was prepared, the first part in which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which was called the sanctuary. And behind the second veil with the tabernacle was the holiest of all, or holy of holies, which was the golden censer and the ark of the covenant, overlaid with all sides with gold, in which were, and here's the three things that are in the ark: the golden pot that had manna, Aaron's rod that had budded, and the tablets of the covenant. So these three things represents the testimony. God said he's going to put the testimony in the ark. And now we know there's these three things, and they represent the testimony in the ark. Manna, Aaron's rod that budded. You recall that people challenged who should be in charge, and God had Moses have all the leaders, the priest leaders, bring their staffs, which you remember is dead wood that people walk with. And they put them together, and when they came back, Aaron's staff had budded and produced fruit, almonds on his staff. The other staffs were still dead wood. And then the third thing is the ark, their covenant. Well, understand this. This is really cool. Who's the bread of life? Manna, the bread of life. Jesus, right? When a dead staff rod suddenly blooms and produces fruit, that's considered resurrection. A dead staff produces that. So who's the resurrection? Jesus. And the third thing that's in there was the tablets of the covenant, the testimony of the covenant. It was the Word of God. Who is the Word of God? Jesus. So all three testimonies that were in the ark is about Jesus. The ark represented the presence of God, and if nothing else, the salvation of God, even to the point that the power was with the ark. When they went to cross the Jordan River, the priest carried the ark and the feet touched the water and the river stops. When they were in battles, they used the ark. In fact, when they were losing, they even brought the ark over to hopefully to win the battle. The ark was the presence and the power of God. It was the testimony of God to his people. The tabernacle was simply a physical dwelling place for the people to see, so that they could feel and understand the presence of God dwelt among them. So we can think of the ark as the presence and power of God. The tabernacle is a physical entity, a means, a ritual, a way, a place, a building or structure in which one can worship. Now you can sort of see that the religious spirit will turn your choice from the presence of God, the ark, and move it towards the accoutrements of worship and religion. And that would have been the tabernacle. Solomon, raised by his dad, who had the ark and understood the ark and built the tabernacle for it, could choose between going to the ark in Jerusalem, which was convenience right there where he lived, where he saw his dad see things happen, and all the stories about the power in the ark, chose to go to the tabernacle. That is the manifestation of a religious spirit. When suddenly our denomination or non-denomination, our pastor, our building, our ministry, our names, the titles, symbols of the ministries, logos for the ministry, the books we write, the tapes we make, all of these things, when those things become important enough that we value and worship them, they are the tabernacle. And that is a religious spirit. When we lose sight that it's about God's testimony, the Ark of the Testimony, which contained everything that we understand about Jesus. When we get our eyes off of Jesus and onto the accoutrements of worship. Oh, we like it because Tom plays the keyboard so well and sings in tune and always gets the words right and forgets where we're at so that he can just go worship. If that's more important to you than your personal worship, despite the songs I picked, despite the fact that I got the wrong key, despite the fact that my rhythm is off, despite the fact that I played the wrong song or say the wrong words, despite all those things, if you can, where you are at, focus your attention on worshiping Jesus, then you have chosen the ark over the covenant. If we think that it's important that we have to be at a certain church on Sundays to mornings, because that's the time for God, we start to embrace the tabernacle instead of the ark. It's all about Jesus, our God. And we can meet Jesus at any time, any place, anywhere, with anybody. And one of the things that we learned from Abe and Effie is God would send them to some of the weirdest churches. And Lyle and I would say, why? You got a Foursquare church there and Assembly of God church there and non-denominational church. Why are you in a Baptist church? And all like that. But to be truthful, God sent them to Methodist church, which ended up for us getting our salvation. So I understand. It's not the place you go. It's going there with the God you know. And if God says go to a dead Baptist church, then do that. God says get on a cruise ship, then do that. God says go live with the homeless, then do that. Because it's not the place, the clothes, the structure, the ritual, the way they do things. You know, did we sing 3 fast songs before we sung our worship song? Why do we sing a slow song and then a fast song and then a slow song again? All of that's ritual. All of that's tabernacle stuff. All of that's religious. And so this is an illustration I think that we need to recognize, especially those of us down here in the Bible Belt. It's religious like crazy. Everybody's religious about everything, whether it's their baseball team or how do you get dressed to go to work. It's all religious. And you can't get away from the religious spirit. But this is one type of religious spirit you can recognize. And when you see other people, when they start talking about, well, who's your covering? What church do you go to? who's your preacher? Well, we go to such and such church. Our pastor's written 3 books, and we once got to go to a conference and heard so-and-so. Are these things important and registering to you? Then you're Tabernacle people. We need to work at being Ark people. And so there's this song, and I'm not going to play it because then we'd have to move the camera again and have all that. But and of course I never get the words right, so you have to do the words yourself. But it helps us to focus a little bit on what I'm talking about here, focusing on the Ark. It goes like this: turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things on earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Let's do it again. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. And so my prayer for all of us is that we wake up and find out how many areas have we got a hold of the tabernacle and turn our eyes to Jesus. Yes. You remember when Peter walked on the water with Jesus, he heard the sound of the waves. It wasn't the waves he was looking at. He heard the sound of the waves. Got his attention off of Jesus and he sank. When we're serving our God and our eyes on Jesus, we can walk on water. We can cast mountains into the oceans, do all sorts of things. It's the tabernacle voices that get us off target. They start saying little things like, oh yeah, but you need to do this. And you need to write a book. You need to write a song. You need to learn to play this instrument. You need to have a home church. You need to start your own ministry. All these little voices, these things will go strangely dim in the light of Jesus' glory and grace.